The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Trad Controversies on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Stephen Heiner, and on this episode, I am joined by the master of controversy, Father Anthony Cekada. Father, I'm glad that you made it through Holy Week and Easter week after, and we're happy to have you with us.
I'm very happy to be here to stir up whatever controversy I can, Stephen.
Indeed. Well, I alluded to Holy Week, Father, and you've gone through that, and I think on a previous episode, a couple seasons back, I asked you about the various names for Dominica and Albis, Quasimodo Sunday, Low Sunday, and I think you remarked Low Sunday maybe because that's how you all are feeling after a long week of Holy Week liturgy. And but you got to celebrate what we know as, I suppose some of us call the real Holy Week. And one of the things that we haven't talked about, it's going to be a future Trad Controversies episode, is the 1962 Missal. So part of that is the assumption, if we're talking about a pre-1955 Missal, we're talking about the non-Novus Ordo Holy Week, whereas anyone who's celebrating anything after 1955, whether they like it or not, the reality is they're doing the Novus Ordo Holy Week and all the ramifications that lie therein. And as we were talking before the show, you said that this issue has gone from maybe, let's say, a pet preoccupation of the liturgical nerd to rather mainstream acceptance.
Yes, indeed, it has. I speak about this a little bit in Work of Human Hands, but when I talk about the question about which missal one should use, that initially in the 70s, the beginning of the 1970s, there were actually only a very few people who latched onto this issue of the New Holy Week versus the Old Holy Week. And it was Father Peter Morgan, who was the first priest in the society ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre, and also a certain seminarian named Daniel Dolan, who made the rest of us aware of this particular issue. And it was the interest in it, and the interest in cultivating and preserving the whole Old Holy Week arose first among the English speakers, what the French call the Anglophones, and then eventually the Germans. But for many years, on the part of many other traditional Catholics, it was looked at as sort of a hobby issue or something that was very, I guess you would say, obscure, that why should people really be worried about this? But it's interesting that now, after all these years, this is an issue that many people who would be considered mainstream traditionalists are talking about. So it's very interesting to see how this has changed in 40 years.
Well, and I don't like talking about feelings when we talk about these matters, Father, because I think there's a cold-blooded way that we can look at this. But I think it's useful. You start one of your most well-known pamphlets, the Welcome to the Traditional Latin Mass, and also in Work of Human Hands, with this idea that people know deep down in their bones something's wrong. There's something wrong here. And I think for me, the first time that I experienced the new Holy Week, I was a new Latin Mass goer. And the 62 Missal has its challenges and its issues for sure and certain, but the contrast with Holy Week is still pretty big. And when you get to Holy Week, and you're saying the Our Father with the priest, you think, wait a minute, this is very disconcerting, especially having just come from the Novus Ordo. We think we're transported back to the time when everything was good and certain. And I suppose that might be a jumping off point for some people. They've never seen the Holy Week that you celebrated last week at St. Gertrude's with all the clergy there. So they've only seen the new Holy Week, but unwittingly they're assisting at the Novus Ordo Holy Week.
Well, this was something also that struck me even before I was really attuned to these different issues, because I had gone from a Novus Ordo seminary, from which I actually functioned as music director of local Novus Ordo parish, and I kept things as conservative as possible according to the book. And I saw what we did there, so I was very familiar with the Novus Ordo rubrics. And then I entered a conservative religious order called the Cistercians, which I've talked about before. And they, of course, were even more conservative and did all sorts of stuff in Latin. And my last Holy Week with them in the Latin version of the Novus Ordo was in 1975 in the monastery of Autrive. From Autrive, eventually I entered at Cone, the Pius X Seminary in southern Switzerland. And my first Holy Week experience there was in 76. And I remember my reaction was, wait a minute, there is not an awful lot in the way of differences between the Latin Novus Ordo Holy Week I did in the Cistercians and this thing. So that was something that's very striking.
Well, and you've done a number of articles over the years, and so one of the clandestine reasons for having Restoration Radio is to get people to unwittingly read your articles. Although reading is that terrible burden that so many moderns face. And in today's
we wish they would go from unwitting to witting by reading the articles.
Yes. That they may be witting, O Lord. And there are two sets of articles that you can use to either follow along in today's episode, or after the episode, you can go and, as Father Cekada once told a very young and lost version of myself, to go look it up. After the episode, you can go and see, and then Father has footnotes for all the points that he makes. So there's two issues. One is the legal issue. We're supposed to obey the last Holy Father, Father Cekada, and that's a great gotcha argument. And then the changes themselves. So we need to talk about those 2 points. So the first issue is the legal issue. And Father deals with this if you go to traditionalmass.org and you go to click on articles and then click on liturgy, John the 23rd and Pius the 12th changes. The first article that Father wrote is called, "Is Rejecting the Pius the 12th Reforms Illegally?" And he penned this in April of 2006. And Father, if you don't mind, I'll just read you the question that you were emailed, that you responded to. So there's two questions. The first one said, "I was wondering how you justify rejection of the Holy Week reforms, quote unquote, under Pius XII. If the principle of epikeia is invoked, it would seem this does not apply given the validity of the reigning pontiff and his rightful authority to make such changes. I was under the impression that epikeia only worked when a law began to work against the common good and needed to be ignored." And further, in reading the arguments from 1955 for the reasons in the changes, the innovators talked of returning to earlier traditions and of simplification of the ceremonies, both of those in quotes. The same arguments made later for the entire Novus Ordo. Admittedly, the whole thing stinks of Bugnini. However, I have two main questions. What does this say to us of Pope Pius XII in those latter years for permitting and utilizing this new ceremony? And also, since we've been in interregnum since 1958, what justifications do we utilize to individually celebrate the older ceremonies, which were replaced before 1958, without making it appear that we are picking and choosing which ceremonies we want to utilize? So I suppose that's a great jumping off point for us, Father. How would you answer those reasonable questions?
Yeah, and indeed, it's a very, very reasonable set of questions that you have there. And what you do is you look at the what gets you thinking about the issue initially is the resemblances between the Novus Ordo Holy Week and the New Holy Week. So how do you deal with that particular question in terms of church law? Well, as with so many issues that traditional Catholics face, you have to look at some general principles. And the one general principle in church law is that a law is supposed to have an element of stability or perpetuity to it. That sure, a law that is a law that the church promulgates can be changed by another lawgiver somewhere down the road. There's no question about that. But the law itself has to have this element of what's called perpetuity or stability to it. What you find when you look at the documentation about the 1955 changes is that it was viewed very clearly as transitional. That the authors of the New Holy Week, Bugnini and company at that point, spoke of it as a bridge between the old and the new, or as an arrow indicating the direction. And they talked about things being done that were only the first step toward a wider reform. And so there's this type of language. And then when you go and research the background documents, you'll see that there is a big, long document in Italian called the Memoria on the liturgical reform. And it clearly outlines it's a couple hundred pages, like 600 pages. It outlines the direction that things are going. So you see then in the legislation this idea that it is not something that's stable, that the laws promulgating it are intended to be transitional until you can get to the next point in the liturgical journey. So from that point of view, the notion in church law of perpetuity and stability, it is certainly justified to say that these laws, while they had been binding then, certainly when we look at the context now, we see that we are not bound by them. The second point is a general principle in church law that I think we've talked about before when it comes to the different permissions that normally would be required for a priest, say, to give a sermon in a diocese or to offer mass in a diocese that's not his own diocese, or to
hearing confessions.
Yeah, hear confessions, all the things that we traditional priests do. Our general approach to those laws is that, well, they are laws that were promulgated for the common good, but now because of a change of circumstance, those laws actually work against the common good and have a harmful effect, and so they cease to bind us. And that's called in church law the principle of cessation, intrinsic cessation of church law. So when it comes to the liturgical question, well, what about the nature of these different liturgical changes? Well, if you look at them in the context of the Novus Ordo, they give support to something that is the false idea that the general Vatican II liturgical reform actually arose out of some sort of a profound tradition in the church, and it was consistent with the development of the sacred liturgy of the church. And so these changes, observing these changes in the 50s, give legitimacy to the idea that the Novus Ordo is entirely in line with tradition, which of course it's not. So from that point of view, the law would cease, because it has this deleterious effect. It gives credence to the Novus Ordo, and in the very document promulgating the Novus Ordo, in fact, the first thing Paul VI talks about is the Pius XII changes, and how that was that what we see in the Novus Ordo is just one more step. So the idea then is that this obviously is a bad effect of the legislation, and you're not bound by it. And so on those 2 points, cessation of law and lack of perpetuity or stability, you're not bound by the legislation.
Now, the quotes that Father is giving us from Bugnini himself is from a book called The Simplification of the Rubrics, which came from 1955. And I'm sure if you want exact page numbers, we might be able to get them for you. But there are some replies to these points from Father that Father addressed in a follow-up article, more on the legal issue, also posted on traditionalmass.org. So the response then to your issue of stability, your point about stability, Father, is that firstly, the quotes are from Bugnini, not from Pius XII. So we have to look at the intentions of Pius XII, I suppose, versus the intentions of Bugnini. And I suppose there's an implied question here about Pius XII, which I don't know if you want to get into in this episode. I suppose Pius XII might be a trad controversies episode all by himself. But I suppose there's those 2 points: the quote unquote intentions of Pius XII and what the legacy of Pius XII is in this particular point.
Okay, well, I mean, the first question is, so we have talked about Bugnini, okay, and his different quotes from the Simplification of the Rubrics, but the document that we mentioned, the 1948 Memoria on a general liturgical reform. This was something that Pius XII knew about. It was presented to him in 1948, and if you go through the document, you see that the Memoria itself talks about what's being done as being aimed toward a general and complete revision of the liturgy of successive phases that have to be taken care of, that eventually you'll get to a code of liturgical law that will stabilize, and it uses that word in Italian. It will guarantee the stabilità of the liturgical reform. So the whole language of the document that Pius the 12th was presented with and read, and it was the background for him approving this legislation, was based on this idea that there would be a series of temporary stages, and that eventually you might end up with stability. But what you had in the meantime was this transitory legislation. There was temporary steps leading to something else. So when you look at that, sure, it was Pius XII himself regarded it as transitory.
Well, so that's the second part of my question, Father. What does that mean that Pius XII was okay with a series of transitional liturgical changes? Can we pierce the veil for what his vision was, or was he being hoodwinked? And I suppose neither of the answers to those really matter, but how does it apply to how we look at Pius XII's changes here, apart from what you were saying?
Well, we obviously you look at what you got, but you try to figure out how could this guy who is impeccable when it came to doctrinal matters drop the ball on some sort of a practical issue like this legislation on the liturgical reform. And I think that's an issue more to do with Pius XII's personality, that he tended to be rather in the clouds when it came to his different ideals, and he simply didn't realize what was going on. So if you're looking for some sort of explanation as regards how some of this could have been achieved, you'll find it there. Also, remember the most radical of the reforms were instituted, were approved during his illness in the mid-50s. And the only people who really had access to him were Montini, and of course we know how he ended up, and Bea, who was his confessor. And Bea was one of the big ecumenists at Vatican II. So these guys had a program, as it were, of their own. And in fact, in his biography or in his memoirs, Bugnini boasts of this, that they had access through these men, and that's how they were able to get some of the liturgical reforms through, despite resistance that they had in other quarters. So if you want some sort of an explanation for it, you find it, I think, there in the psychology of Pius XII. He didn't. His practical judgment was, not always exactly on target.
We recently did a member survey, and one of the comments that kept coming up is that there's lots of people who listen to Restoration Radio who are new to in Catholicism, as it always has been. They've come to us from the Novus Ordo or other places, and there might have been a sharp intake of breath when the words "drop the ball" and Pius XII were in the same sentence, and I felt a little air come out of my microphone, and I thought, well, you should probably give a bit more background to that, because I think we're used to Father Cekada on Francis Watch, and we know what we think of the post Vatican II claimants, and they provide us with the news stories every month. But with Pius XII, there's as I say, it may be a trad controversies episode all on its own. But do you find that people are uncomfortable when you say that Pius XII did anything wrong, given that he's the last pope that we can look back to and recognize as pope?
Well, I think...
Is there some sensitivity among people and, shall we say, clerics on this issue?
Well, I mean, that yes, there is in some quarters, but I think that if you listen, you on the other hand, you do have many people who listen to the articles and who figure that, well, someone must have been for Vatican II to happen. Someone must have been letting up a little in certain areas where he shouldn't have let up. And that leads you to the conclusions about Pius XII. If you understand, his background and you see how he actually dealt with controversies and with people who should have been dealt with severely, then the explanation, I think, seems most reasonable.
Well, and now we're going to get into those changes. I think we've fairly dealt with the questions and the objections for the first 2 points you brought up, which were cessation and stability. There were a couple other points that people had brought up, and I suppose we can deal with those rather quickly, because they're not big objections, I think, compared to the first two. Mm-hmm. How does this issue, the fact that you're rejecting a Holy Week that was promulgated by a pope, a valid pope, mm-hmm. How does this relate to indefectibility?
Yeah, the issue is the church is indefectible and cannot promulgate a universal disciplinary law, which is evil or which harms doctrine. But as regards the issue that we're talking about, all theologians teach that a law that was not evil at the time, not evil in itself at the time it was promulgated, can become harmful later on through the passage of time, because the human legislator cannot foresee all the possible circumstances in the future for an ecclesiastical law. So it's not really an objection to say that you had to say that, well, rejecting these changes means that the church defects. No, it's very clear from the teaching of the canonists that you have changed circumstances. So something that was not harmful in itself can, after the passage of time, be harmful.
The objection that follows on from indefectibility is Father Cekada is just engaging in his own, shall we say, Schmidberger shift by deciding what he wants to obey from which pope. How do you respond to that, Father?
Well, the answer to that is that first, we're simply applying legal principles, and secondly, the Pope is dead. We're not saying that there is a living pontiff and that we're going to sift all of his different statements and reject what we think is not Catholic and accept what we think is Catholic. That's a different thing from what we're doing, because here we're talking
exhausting, I might add.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Holding the great sifter all the time for everything that JP2 or Bergoglio says. So it is something that's completely different, because you have a living Roman pontiff, you have to be subject to him. And we're talking about legislation from the past here.
Well, the last objection is the one I led with originally, Father, because it's the most emotionally charged and gotcha sort of statement, which is, well, you should obey, the legislation of the last living pope. He was a pope and you're supposed to obey that. And I suppose, obviously, parts of that argument are dealt with in at least two other points we've already said before. But if someone says that, how would you respond?
Well, because they were dealt with before on the basis of objective principles in church law on cessation and on stability, you can't really make that charge, because if the principles that we've invoked were truly contrary to the virtue of obedience, then the theologians who proposed them, the great canonists who proposed them, would not have done so. So from that very fact, there can be no contradiction in the principles, and that's the basis for it. These great minds of the church would not have laid down the principles on cessation and perpetuity if it had truly been contrary to the virtue of obedience.
Want to remind our listeners that you're listening to Trad Controversies on the Restoration Radio Network. That's Father Anthony Cekada, who's been walking us through the legal questions behind the use or non-use of the Pius XII changes to the Holy Week, also referred to as the pre-55 Holy Week, is not the Pius XII revision. We want to remind you that Trad Controversies is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. Permission can usually be quite easily obtained by writing to mail, MAIL, at truerestoration.org. The next set of articles I want to discuss, Father, are the changes themselves, and you can find these articles at fathercekada.com, which is a website also titled Quidlibet, in which Father deals with, shall we say, one-off questions or questions of particular interest, and they don't fit the normal academic style that we would find on traditionalmass.org. This is sort of Father Cekada unscripted, as much as you can find a perfectionist organ player in such a state. Father, as I was reading through some of these articles in preparation for today's episode, I thought to myself, as someone who studies so often, as you're setting up or getting ready, do you ever ponder the changes as you're putting on, let's say, violet vestments for Palm Sunday? Do you think about the Holy Week changes and what a departure it is? Or I figure you're one of the people that has dealt with it so much in your writing that it's in a way it's always in the back of your mind, perhaps, all these changes.
Yes, actually I do, because that understanding the history of these different elements in the liturgy really gives you a perspective when it comes to celebrating it. Myself, or say functioning as a church musician, you really you're attentive to the details, and you understand why. In many instances, the historical reasons for why you're doing what you're doing, and of course, that only leads to a greater appreciation for it. So, yeah, it does occur to me quite a bit.
Well, if you go to FatherCekada.com, you go to the right-hand side and you can look at the tags. Just click on Holy Week as one of the tags, and you're going to get all 6 of the articles that Father has penned so far to deal with this. And we're just going to go by various days. And again, this is just a 1-hour episode, so we can't really get too deep into the changes, but I think Father can give us a good gloss on each of these days. And we're going to start with Palm Sunday. Father, tell us what was traditional, what was changed, and what we should take away from that.
All right, briefly, what you had in essence were 2 masses. The ceremony for the blessing of palms was the survival of a rite of mass with its own propers that was used to bless the palms, and then one went to celebrate the Passion aspect of Palm Sunday in another place. So you have in the traditional ceremony this little mass with the equivalent, say, of an introit, a collect, an epistle, a gospel. There's even a preface. You sing the Sanctus, and then these different blessing prayers, long, very beautiful blessing prayers in French are actually of French origin. That is to say, are recited. The palms are blessed. Then you have the distribution of palms. You have a procession outside, and at the door of the church, there's this hymn of Saint Theodulf of Orleans that is sung, Gloria Laus, and then the subdeacon knocks on the door, symbolizing the Christ's demanding entry into Jerusalem, and then there's the procession into the church itself, at which you have a mass, at which the Passion is chanted or is recited. So that's the beginning of the traditional ceremony. What you have in the 55 version is that it's stripped down. You have a collect or 2. The celebrant recites the blessing prayers facing the people, and then hands out the palms, and then you have your procession, and so you have the abolition of all this ancient ceremonial, and something that of course is a great pity. I had someone send me a link on Palm Sunday of the blessing of palms conducted in the 55 rite by a priest who said the traditional mass. And I mean, it was really strikingly bare. It really struck me, how much, in fact, was missing and how much it was like the Novus Ordo. So there's all this stuff that simply went, that was simply cut out and reduced to its minimum. And then you had the phenomenon where the prayers at the foot of the altar were cut out in the 55 rite. So the priest, when he comes back to the church, goes up to the altar and then reads the introit, there are two chunks of the Passion that are cut out. The Creed is cut out, and the last Gospel is removed as well. So you have this idea of stripping down the liturgy on Palm Sunday.
Well, and if anyone's dismayed by listening to Father's all the cuts that were made, you can see it getting cut to ribbons. I have to say, I wouldn't just call it the 1955. I would say it's the Novus Ordo. This is one of those painful times of year that anyone who goes to the Motu Mass or a 1958 Mass, they get to celebrate in communion with the Novus Ordo because it's the same ceremonies that the Novus Ordo uses.
Yes, I remember it. Remember this being done in 1970 at St. Rita's in Milwaukee, which was the Palm Sunday, which was the premiere day for the Novus Ordo in English. And I remember being a part of that, and seeing this little simple ceremony, and it's virtually identical.
Well, speaking of simple ceremonies, there's the new office of Tenebrae that comes in with these changes as well. First of all, I suppose, Father, since we haven't, I don't think we've done a Restoration Radio episode on Tenebrae. It reminds me that definitely we should do that sometime. Can you tell our listeners what that is, and then talk about the changes?
All right. Tenebrae refers to three ceremonies, three religious services held in the evening of Holy Week. And what they are is they're chunks of the divine office that the priest would normally recite from his, that is to say, part of the breviary. Only they're chanted in church. There's a series of psalms and then scripture readings and patristic readings. Progressively, as the church also gets darker, as the darkness increases with the sun going down, the candles in the sanctuary of the church are extinguished. There's this contraption called a hearse that has a certain number of candles on it, and after you recite each psalm, one of the candles is extinguished. And finally, at the end of the whole long rite, there's only the Benedictus is chanted. All of the candle altars, that the altar candles are then extinguished. The Benedictus is sung, and the one remaining lit candle is hidden. And the Miserere is chanted in the dark in the church, and then there's the Strepitus, which is the noise, the noise, symbolic noise of the earthquake at the death of Christ, which is made by beating your books on the pews or by using the Holy Week clackers to make this racket at the end. And then the one candle is placed at the top of the hearse, and the ceremony ends at that point. So it's a very dramatic ceremony. You have all of this long chanting in a church that's becoming darker. Then at the end you have this great dramatic noise. So this was conducted in cathedral churches and religious churches on the evening of Wednesday evening, Thursday evening, and Friday evening, and Holy Saturday. And it's one of the most mystical rites of the church. And it was very, very impressive.
Although I suppose some parents might be grateful that there's no once-a-year sanction for their children to do what they do throughout the year with their books on the pews.
Yes, that's right.
That might have been a pastoral reason to abolish that, Father. But
well, the kids do get a kick out of it. They get a kick out of the earthquake at the end. The altar boys love it. So,
well, I'm sure they're half wondering whether they're going to be struck down afterwards because they can't possibly be allowed to do this.
Yeah, that's right. But what happened to this in the Holy Week, in the new Holy Week, is that all of the mystical symbolism was pulled out of it. It was no longer done in the darkness at night. You did it in the morning. You didn't have the extinguishing of candles. You didn't have the anything like the encroaching darkness. So it was made, all of the mystical symbolism was just pulled out of it, and it was turned into a celebration of the divine office in the morning. And that was it.
And I'm thinking now, Father, we removed the knocking at the door for Palm Sunday, and we're removing this, and I wonder why Bugnini was so bothered by this. Was he worried that someone was coming for judgment, and he heard that?
Maybe he was worried that the devil would come and knock on his door.
Right. I'm tired of all this door knocking. I'm just going to get rid of it in the liturgy altogether.
Yeah, you'd update it to a bell or something like that.
Well, speaking of bells, that gets us to the Maundy, and Maundy Thursday, also known as Holy Thursday. And what were the changes? And we're not speaking here of changes like deciding to wash the feet of Muslims or women. I think that's probably a bridge too far for even Bugnini.
Sure.
You'd have to wait many years for that. But what were some of the other changes we saw for Maundy Thursday?
Well, of the changes, this was the least changed as far as the rites. You had in the traditional rite, you had your mass in the morning all the time, and with this, these changes, it was moved to the evening. In itself, there's nothing wrong with that. That's simply a time change. However, you have these indications of kind of what is to come. Different things are sliced off. So the creed no longer appears in the Holy Thursday Mass. The last Gospel no longer appears. Then you have during communion, you have a phenomenon which you now see in the Novus Ordo, a responsorial psalm that is sung during communion. The 55 rites have you do the washing of the feet if you want in the rite of the Mass itself. Now, the traditional practice for the washing of the feet was you had a separate ceremony apart from the Mass, generally in the afternoon, in which people's feet were washed. But this was now included in the Mass. And you had at the end of the traditional rite, the Blessed Sacrament is taken to an elaborately decorated repository generally in a separate chapel, and you adore the Blessed Sacrament until it's removed during the Good Friday service the following day. So you had traditionally this practice of having a very decorated repository with candles and even some lilies and lights, and to honor the Blessed Sacrament. But in the 55 rite, they recommend that you not do this, that it be very severe and simple, and that you do not continue the adoration until the next day, the Mass of the Presanctified, which is what was done in the traditional rite, but it just sort of ends at midnight. So, and that is also the practice in the Novus Ordo. So you have this. What you have here is this cutting away of things, and an element of taking away some honors traditionally paid to the Blessed Sacrament.
Well, I noticed at the end of your article on this, Father, you say that the 1955 Holy Week rites make it nearly impossible to watch just 1 hour with our Lord. But, I mean, you have to keep in mind they may be trying to restore this to apostolic tradition, which would include falling asleep during that hour. So maybe that's what they were looking to do, is just skip the hour and go right to bed.
Well, perhaps, but I suspect it was a little more. It would have a little more to do with the 30 pieces of silver business, but that's another issue.
Well, the 30 pieces of silver do lead us to Good Friday. And this is probably, for me personally, the most disturbing day of the Holy Week changes that I experienced. The first time, again, that I went through, that I came over from the Novus Ordo, that I thought, oh, I'm safe. I'm at the traditional Mass now, and I don't have to worry about these things. And I went to a Good Friday in the 1962 within the SSPX that they celebrated in 1962, and I was just shocked by what I saw. And again, all the changes are different for different days, but I perhaps maybe it's because it's Good Friday that it hit home with me a bit more. Father, what are your reflections on the changes for Good Friday?
Well, before, in the traditional rites, it was called the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified, and you had a number of elements, in fact, in the latter part of the service that were sort of taken from the Mass, even though Mass was not celebrated that day. But there were a number of odd things about the 55 Good Friday service that paralleled the Novus Ordo, that the celebrant conducts the service from the sedilla, or a seat on the side rather than the altar. And this reminds one of the Novus Ordo president's chair, that you try to get the priest away from the altar as much as possible. Then he doesn't read a scripture reading if a minister chants it. That's another innovation. The solemn orations on Good Friday, the text had a series of changes. First of all, that the prayer for heretics and schismatics has been sort of rebranded as the prayer for the unity of Christians. So you see the relabeling.
I think rebrand is probably a good term.
I'm not sure, if they used an ad agency or something like that to do that. But then the old rite directed that no genuflection be made in the prayers for the Jews, while the new rite directs that genuflection be made there. Incidentally, what happened to that prayer is that John the 23rd himself changed the text of the prayer. So there was a further change that you find in, say, the 1962 Missal. The rite for the adoration of the cross was changed. People in the traditional rite would come up to the communion rail and kiss the cross. Then all of the different mystical ceremonies that you had at the end of this Mass of the Pre-Sanctified were abolished. You didn't have the solemn procession of the Blessed Sacrament, where you sang this hymn, Vexilla Regis. The elements of the offertory rite were gone, but one of the most striking things to me, and you mentioned it already, was that all the people were supposed to recite the Pater Noster, the Our Father, together. And that is completely contrary to the liturgical tradition of the Roman Church. And in fact, you find that fact mentioned in the writings of St. Augustine. So you had this different, once again, a series of cutting away and changes that prefigure the Novus Ordo. So it's another trial balloon, and when if you are attentive to the different details of the Novus Ordo, and you look at a celebration of Good Friday in the 55 rite, these are the things that you see.
Well, and it's one of those things when you hear the silence broken and people reciting around you, it cracks that veil that the Roman Rite gives us in a low Mass or in a non-sung ceremony. And it's strange. It really is. Because it feels like, for those of us who grew up in the Novus Ordo, who only knew the Novus Ordo our whole lives, as I did, it feels oddly and horribly familiar. I mean, the next thing, I'm waiting for some Marty Haugen and Nightmares to return after that. Yeah. So, Well, there's a huge change for the vigil for Holy Saturday, and I suppose that the big change for most people is the conception of the evening, that midnight ceremony, as normative. We those of us who grew up in the Novus Ordo, I remember staying up. My parents would encourage me to. We'd sleep between, let's say, 8 and 10, so we'd be ready to stay up for the vigil. And it was one of the few times of year we were allowed to stay up so late because it was a very important church ceremony. So I suppose that's the first thing, Father, for people who are used to this idea of a midnight ceremony as very traditional and ancient. How would you answer that? And I suppose then you can lead us into the other changes that were less, let's say, in your face.
Yeah, the change of time again is not something that's necessarily would have been necessarily objectionable. Okay, but this was yet another trial balloon, and it was something. The change of time was supposed to be a restoration, but in fact it ended up being completely bogus. We were told that, well, by having in the evening, that this is what the early Christians did, that you had a mass maybe around midnight, something like that, and this was simply restoration. But if you understand anything about the way the liturgy worked in the ancient church, you can see that the New Holy Week ceremony for the vigil doesn't correspond to that. You spent all night in the church. You started when the sun was going down, and you didn't have mass until the morning. There's no business. There were no naps, and waking up at 10 o'clock. And you had all of these readings in Latin and Greek and litanies where the petitions would be sung 7 times, and great crowds of people being baptized, and it was a serious business. That was at least reflected in the length of the ceremonies in the traditional rite. But here you ended up in the Pius XII rite with just 4 readings, and that was it. So it's bogus from that point of view. And the idea for a Christian celebrating Mass in the middle of the night was very much against the ancient practice of the church. You did it in the morning. So right from there, it's something that's bogus.
Well, and I suppose you bring up an important point. When you've got hundreds or even thousands of people getting ready to be baptized, some of those traditions are just, I don't want to say background music, but to make sure that the non-catechumens were able to sing and encourage and sort of give a background ceremony to the baptisms that were going on.
Sure. So it's a completely different. The justification for the time change was completely empty, and the way, in fact, that it's worked out now is with the Novus Ordo that's all been moved to the evening, to the early evening, so you kind of get it over with.
And as I said, there's definitely a lot of changes. Father has just glossed over some of them. You can find this article, as I said, all of the articles on the changes themselves on Quedlibet, which is fathercekada.com. The last thing I want to speak about within the context of Holy Week before we conclude today's episode, Father, is the issue, and I think I had meant to ask this regarding the prayer for the Jews that had been changed in 62, and there was all of this controversy about whether the Society of St. Pius X would accept it or not. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes addressing that controversy and reflecting on it.
Okay, well, the text of the prayer for the Jews in the traditional rite speaks of the unbelief of the Jews, their blindness, the idea that their perfidy, their unbelief, and so on. and this was considered to be obviously in an ecumenical context, was considered to be something that was, quite incorrect to do, and that this prayer should be modified or abolished. What in fact happened is John the 23rd removed some of the phrases from it, referring to the perfidy of the Jews, and eventually, when the post-Vatican II Church under Benedict XVI permitted the celebration of Mass using the 62 Missal, there were still objections to what was left in the prayer about the conversion of the Jews. So he, in turn, put out a new prayer that was to be inserted in the 1962 Missal. So it was quite a bit of controversy. The thing to be remembered, however, is that the actual text of the Good Friday prayers for the Jews is a part of a series of the most ancient collects in the Church's arsenal of prayers. These go back, you might say, almost to the day of the catacombs. And the idea that John the 23rd and that Benedict the 16th would dare to change these prayers is really completely outrageous.
Well, and that, again, brings us to the conclusion of our episode today, Father. And I wanted to end where we started by alluding to the fact that this is no longer a fringe issue. I think you pointed out, as we were talking before the show, that there was an article recently about this issue. And indeed, a sponsor for one of your shows from last season, Roman, the fact that there was even an impetus to move forward on a 1955 missal, that there is, and that people from the Fraternity of St. Peter were interested in this, that if you're buying a 1955 missal, you've already dealt with the issue of Holy Week. You're not going to be using the revised Holy Week. You're going to be using the pre-55 version. So based on that article that you referred to, and in the current situation, having looked back at your first article on this that hit the internet in 2006, we're almost 10 years on. What are your observations?
Well, it's extremely encouraging that people are coming around to this, and in fact, there's more and more documentation to support this particular position. The article that I mentioned to you before was written by, I believe, Father Stefano Carusi, who is he's either Peter Fraternity or the Institute of Christ the King, and I mean he discovered even more and more divergences between the traditional practices and what was done in the 55 Holy Week. So this is, in fact, is a hot topic, and is one that people are very aware of. And I find that very, very encouraging that people are indeed coming around to it. That bodes very well for the future.
Well, Father, I know that we've talked before about the fact that you got your organ and you got a chance to trot it out for Holy Week. How did that go?
Very well. In fact, on the SGG
site, no organ malfunctions, I'm hoping.
No, and it was a successful transplant, and no one had to die as a result of the transplant. You can find on the sgg.org site, in fact, a recording of the Marsh trumpet fanfare that I used on Holy Saturday to show off the trumpets of the organ. Soon we are going to have a blessing and dedication once we get the memorial plaque, question of the memorial plaque all settled for the organ. And this past Sunday, our young organist here played the famous Bach Toccata and Fugue in D minor after the High Mass. So we're going to be putting up a recording of that at some point. So those of you who participated in our campaign can enjoy some of the fruits of it.
That sounds wonderful. Is there anything else going on at SGG or SGG Resources that you want to keep us abreast of before I let you get back to work today?
Well, we have a Work of Human Hands is available once again, and thanks to your generosity in that particular campaign, and we are now shipping orders for that. So please spread the word. And I will be doing another email promo for that very soon in the future, so you can watch for that if you're on our email list.
And some might be asking, Father, any chance of getting more videos of your Work of Human Hands, the video series that has been long loved and followed?
Well, I'm certainly hoping so, but my time has been very much occupied these days in doing radio programs. So surprisingly, we'll have someone else to blame for that, Stephen.
Well, we are looking forward to those when those get completed. If you haven't checked out Father's videos there at the Work of Human Hands YouTube channel, which is probably youtube.com/Work of Human Hands, I'm guessing, Father. And if you haven't seen those videos, they're a great companion to the book. I wouldn't say they're a great substitute. They're a great companion for the book, or they're a great way to get you interested in the book. It is a scholarly work. It is quite a bit to get into, but I would encourage you, if you've missed out on it, it's been out of print for just a little while, get a copy of it. And as Father said, you can find it on sggresources.org. Father, thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to having you on other radio programs this month, and thank you for coming back from Holy Week.
And we thank you and look forward to meeting you again sometime on Restoration Radio.
Thank you, Father. All of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask that if you found this show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and to your faith, that you please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help make our network worthwhile. Remember, if you have any questions for Father about anything that we talked about in today's episode, you can send an email to controversies@truerestoration.org. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even a simple Ave for our work the next time you pray. For the Restoration, I am Stephen Heiner. May God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.